Mr. Young, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to join my colleagues in offering my congratulations to Chairman Ryan for his ascension to this position. I want to thank all of you, our panelists, for being here today for this freewheeling conversation. I'd like to talk about tax reform, something that's been brought up a number of times today, but specifically focusing on tax reform for our smaller businesses, our younger firms. Last Congress, we put together a draft, the so-called Camp draft, under former Chairman Camp's leadership. And analysis indicated that were that draft implemented, albeit imperfect and requiring further iteration and elaboration, hopefully this Congress, we would increase the rate of GDP in this country, increasing GDP by up to $3.4 trillion and increasing employment by 1.8 million jobs. I do have concerns, however, back to the small and the younger firms about some intimation by the President and by others in this town that we may only consider corporate reform as opposed to reforming the individual code so that those pass-through entities like S corporations and LLCs get the benefit of simplification on one hand and on marginal rate reduction, knowing that many of them pay over half their profits in taxes when you combine the taxes at different levels of government. It bears reminding, perhaps not you, but many of our constituents, that over the last decade, more than 6 out of 10 new jobs created in this country have been through these smaller firms. And this is where over half of jobs currently exist in this country. So really my question for all of you is do you agree, I'll start with Dr. Holtz-Eakin. Do you agree that we should be focusing on reforming not just the corporate code, but also taking a look at the individual code? And what would be the broader economic implications of only focusing on corporate as opposed to focusing on the entire Internal Revenue Code?
Well, if you focus on corporate only, you limit your ability to improve the taxation of business income and incentives for hiring, investment, expansion. There's no doubt about that. I think everyone who wants to broaden bases, lower rates, and improve the quality of tax policy in the United States would do both individual and corporate simultaneously for the reasons we discussed earlier, that you want to make sure the pass-throughs are treated in a sensible fashion. There are some particularly vexing issues in the tax treatment of business income and investment income in the individual code right now, not the least of which is we now have 3 different tax codes: the ordinary income tax, the alternative minimum tax, and the new net investment surtax with a different definition of net investment that doesn't exist anywhere. And so, as a top priority, simplification of tax codes so that there's one set of tax rules that's permanent would help, especially the smaller guys trying to deal with a business as a pass-through in a big way. And then we've done a lot of backsliding from the 1980s when we got marginal rates down much lower. And the biggest obstacle to doing comprehensive reform, individual plus corporate, is the unwillingness of some to contemplate lower top marginal tax rates. It was done in the '86 reform, was very successful, and it's been unwound in the years since.
Mr. Feldstein, if you could offer me, say, 30 to 45 seconds, your perspective.
28%. That was the rate that we had after the 1986 tax reform. It's now up in the 40s. So that's a very big difference for anybody who's contemplating a small business or expanding a small business.
Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Young, don't forget, in 1986, there was an equalization of the tax rates on labor income and capital income, and that's a principle that I think we should go back to, because what you get is, if you're considering the distortions and the disincentives, and if you're considering comprehensive tax reform, and I think you should think comprehensively, and you should think comprehensively on a revenue neutral, I would say revenue building basis, given the challenges the country faces, the differential taxation between labor income and capital income introduces a lot of distortions, and I think you should go back to on that point to the principles of 1986.
And in my remaining time, Dr. Feldstein, should we coordinate reform between, as we reform the tax system, should we also consider coordinating those reforms with reform of the welfare system in this country?
Well, the welfare system, as previous comments have brought out, have become a disincentive for working for lower income people. And we really ought to be looking at what food stamps, for example, has done to the incentive, particularly for second earners.
Are there provisions of the code, however, that we ought to consider taking a look at with respect to this matter?
Yes.
Would help individual persons, and what might they be?
Well, I wouldn't draw the distinction between the tax code and the safety net provisions, but almost 50 million individuals are now receiving food stamps, and that creates very serious incentives for second earners. It creates a very high effective marginal tax rate for that group.
Right. As you pull away the benefits. Thank you. I yield back.